Hi, and welcome to the 6th episode of Two Hard Questions. Today we have McCall Jones to talk to us about race. McCall, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. This should be an interesting talk. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I have an MA in International Relations, and I am known for looking at things a little bit differently from for most people. I grew up, growing up in Boston. I was there for the forced court-ordered busing, the forced segregation of the Boston public school system. I got to see the now famous buses with all their windows smashed out driving by me. It looked like 70 miles an hour. I mean, I was like in second or third grade, and I got to see that. And I also got to meet the people who ultimately smashed out those windows. And I did not perceive that they were at all racist. The issue that they had and the issue that they described rather openly was they didn't like having outsiders come into their neighborhood. They didn't care who those outsiders happened to be. What they were protesting was their loss of sovereignty and their own loss of community. And I got to see and hear that from the people firsthand, as well as a very interesting PBS documentary that came out probably 20 years after the fact. So my views on race, vary because I look at both the racial dynamic, I look at the economics, and I also look at who are the types of people that tend to be the most sensitive to issues of race. And they all tend to have something that's remarkably consistent, and as well as what their solutions are. You know, the people who seem to be the most vocal and the most active around the racial conversation, I find tend to be very left-leaning. And they've gone from very left-leaning to extremely left-leaning these days. And I found that to be a very interesting uniformity, if you will, to the racial question, certainly here in the United States. Another angle I have is I lived in Europe for almost 7 years, and I did not experience any of the racial dynamics that go on here in the United States. I think, in fact, the racial dynamics that happen here in the US are actually quite unique. I think slavery, as it happened here, happened in the country, whereas other countries that were involved in the slave trade didn't necessarily have those slaves in their country. They typically transferred them to the US or Brazil during the slave trade. So the slaves themselves weren't such a presence in these countries, if I'm not mistaken. But living in Europe gave me a perspective of being treated more like a human being, which is something that doesn't necessarily happen here. For me personally, I felt more at home, I felt more welcome. And what I saw was the separations in Europe was really more about nationalities versus race. So people might look at me, and once they realized I was not from continental Africa and they recognized I was an American, I was instantly treated like one of them. So the dynamics of race, I noticed, are very different based on geography. When I spent time in Taiwan,
can I just
sure.
Can I just pull you up there? The Boston thing that you witnessed when you were young, what year, without revealing your age, what year are we talking about here?
Well, it's kind of hard to
we'll reveal your age.
No, that's fine. I don't mind that. I mean, I think it's also kind of hard to hide the age based on the fact that we know that it's easy to look up, right? So the forced busing happened, I believe, in 1972, 73, somewhere in that. I forget the exact year, but somewhere in the early 70s.
And what was the forced busing?
Okay. So basically what had happened was neighborhoods in Boston have historically been quite segregated. A lot of that, of course, it has its own political roots. And historically, the Irish were just as maltreated as blacks were. As if you recall, if anyone is frequent historical documentaries of the time, or even Gangs of New York for that matter, most ethnic groups were segregated. They arrived here, they joined communities of their own, meaning, they were uniform of the Irish were in Irish areas, the Italians were in Italian areas, and the blacks were actually coming up from the South during that time, during the Great Migration, because the treatment of blacks in the North was actually much more palatable and safer, to say the least, up north. So blacks were actually making their way to the north, to populated urban cities. So that said, by the time the 70s rolls around, somebody comes up with the great idea that diversity is our strength, and said, okay, we're going to basically have Black students be bused into predominantly white schools, and we're going to take white kids from other neighborhoods and bust them into predominantly Black schools, and we're going to give both sets of kids a new lease on life and a new way to see the world, and hopefully reduce racism. So that's basically what that situation was about. That's not how it worked out.
Okay.
That was the original idea.
You mean
I gotcha. And
too?
sorry, Jessi.
So do you mean racism didn't end in 1972?
I don't know when exactly it ended, but I've heard that we live in a post-racial America now. So I'm not sure exactly when it actually came to a crashing end. But here's the irony. I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I want to hear the irony. What's the irony?
The irony is, and this informed a lot of my opinion on race. The irony was, I've experienced overt racism from the very first day I moved to Los Angeles in ways that I've never experienced racism in Boston, and having grown up there. So the racism that I experienced here in Los Angeles was infinitely more intense and more obvious than I ever experienced in Boston. So for example, if I'm in this only happened a couple of times, but it was when I first moved out here. So of course it leaves an impression. I was in a pharmacy, won't say the name of the pharmacy, but I found myself being followed very closely by security guards. And I'd heard that that's what happens when people are profiled, but I'd never actually experienced it myself. So it was pretty obvious that that's what was going on. They just followed me through my entire trip through the store. Not to mention the fact that here in Los Angeles, the neighborhoods are extremely racially segregated. So you can drive down a street, it's all Black street. You can drive down the next street, it's an all white street. In a lot of ways, it's just like Northern Ireland without the explosions. Their explosions during the Troubles in Northern Ireland might have been every week or so. Here, they're every 2 or 3 decades. But they still happen. And so my travels actually inform me a lot about what race is and is not.
Well, I was going to ask you to expand on the European stuff, but what we'll do is we'll jump into Jessi's 2 hard questions, and no doubt along the way you'll be able to share your perspective from Europe,
Sure.
You know, if appropriate. So, Jessi, I'm going to hand over to you to ask the first of the 2 hard questions.
All right, thank you, Gerard. All right, McCall. So our first hard question for you is, can racism ever be a positive thing?
Oof. Can racism ever be a positive thing? I guess I would need more clarification of the question. What do you mean by that? Because that's a very flat question and a very broad topic.
I think it might a little bit touch on probably what you were talking about in Europe, where you perceived it more as nationalism, I think, than racism. But maybe like culturally, I have heard the argument that some cultures don't mix well, things like that.
Well,
I think also, McCall, I'd add that really, you know, when you're talking about racism, you're often talking about tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at places like Africa, they're incredibly tribal. You go to Nigeria, and you've got 54 tribes there, and without even really changing what we would call race, they have all of the same social dynamics that we have with multi-races, just within one race. So I suppose the idea behind the question is, can positive things come of racism? Is it conceivable, or is all racism bad no matter what?
Well, with Jessi's and your clarification of the question, I would argue that what you both described eliminates the fundamental nature of race being at the core of the problem. Because you mentioned tribalism, and certainly I got to see that tribalism in my trips to Northern Ireland. I mean, between the Orange men and the Republicans, that's clear tribalism. Both sides are a bunch of white people. If you go off to the Balkans, it's white people, but it's still tribalism. And there's still the same types of segregation that are going on there as you would find in other countries that segregate one group against another. So my fundamental premise is that racism per se doesn't necessarily even exist. It's just people's misunderstandings of things like tribalism and cultural differences. And in a lot of cases, religious differences. I've discovered that the press does a great job of eliminating distinctions by using words that don't mean anything. So for example, growing up, I got to hear a lot about what was going on in Northern Ireland, and they would say, well, it's sectarian violence. But what I learned years later, having gotten a master's in international relations, that the phrase sectarian violence actually tells you nothing about the conflict, because until you know who the factions are, you don't know what's at stake. So until I recognized that not only the conflict in Northern Ireland was a conflict between Protestants and Catholics, what I could further understand is that the Protestants were supporting the United Kingdom, or remaining part of the United Kingdom, while the Catholics were fighting to rejoin Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland and unify the island. So to understand those things is to understand the larger dimensions that are at stake. This was not merely a sectarian conflict. This was at its heart a nationalistic conflict that was ultimately diminished in clarity by the media. So the media does what I think is a brilliant, not in a positive way, but I think they do a brilliant job of obfuscating what would otherwise be remarkably easy dynamics to understand. And that's just one example.
But if you look at things like culture and genetics, it was interesting. The last time I was in Nigeria, I was on I was at a bar with a few of the smartest people I think I've ever met. And they started asking me questions about what genome type I was. And I didn't know anything about this. And obviously in Nigeria, it's a big thing that, you know, different genetic groups, I Googled this when I got back because, you know, as a Westerner, I've never learned anything about this, that there are some human genomes that shouldn't breed with other human genomes, apparently.
Interesting.
And I had to go to Nigeria to be told this, and this isn't sort of tin hat stuff, you know, if you Google it, and I think genome is the right term. I'd have to look it up. I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but yeah, that it seems that, you know, if you look at interracial relationships, that chances are that if you're, you know, a Black American or an African in general, you're going to marry an African. And if you're white, you're going to marry a white. And if you're Asian, you're going to marry an Asian. These really are, in a multicultural society, forms of racism. A lot of people would argue. But is there a problem with Black people marrying Black people and white people marrying white people?
Well, again, we get down to another dimension, and you're talking about genetics, which then gets us into the conversation of certainly biology and IQ. And I'm certainly by no means an expert in genome science, but I would argue that once we start talking about biology, there are some distinctions that become necessary. I don't think that it can be dissolved or diluted down to race alone. Because once you start talking biology, you know, you immediately get into the conversation of why it's not appropriate to breed with a sibling, for example. There are numbers of diseases that are then prompted and promulgated through similar genetics. So I guess by definition, if you want to summarize it as race, you can say that yes, in some cases there are good reasons for quote unquote racism. But I would also argue that it gets to a biological argument that we culturally and socially are in no way informed enough to actually be able to make. So we take detours called eugenics that then basically takes what is true or what could be true, and then it basically politicizes the use of genetics in terms of making a superior race, which therefore by definition infers that other races or specific races are inferior to the person who's waving the eugenics flag. And we've been through that phase, but connected directly to genetics is measures of IQ. And based on certain genetics, we know objectively that certain groups have higher IQs than other groups. And because of the failed eugenics experiment, which curiously started in the US and migrated its way to Germany in the late 20s and 30s, makes it really difficult to look at biology to determine anything because of that, of how much of a nightmare all of that conversation became. So we're extremely squeamish about talking about genetics and the dispositions that are produced via looking at it genetically. So it's a very dangerous topic, and I think legitimately so to some degree, but it causes us to ultimately harm ourselves moving forward, because if you're taking two parties that maybe shouldn't breed together, you're causing a problem down the road. But socially and societally, that's basically all we do. We take a look at a problem and then choose the wrong direction and race toward it as fast as we possibly can, and then scratch our heads as to why there's a riot down the block, you know, a couple of years later.
So
Yeah, and I have to. Yeah, sorry, Jessi, you go.
well, I'm kind of going to change topics. So if you have anything you want to start.
No.
So,
No.
Topic, but what about like reverse, what some people might call reverse racism? Does it behoove a group, if they're being discriminated against, does it not behoove them to discriminate back and choose their own, you know, race over that race?
I don't believe so. I don't believe that, you know, I came up with an observation years ago that even if you do the wrong thing for the right reasons, it's still doing the wrong thing, and doing the wrong thing has consequences. And unfortunately, you know, we're now living those consequences. We're seeing the ultimately negative results of affirmative action. We've seen it in race, we've seen it in gender, and we've seen where people still, in spite of the removal of certain obstacles, we're seeing that people still gravitate towards certain professions, certain skill sets, whether or not they would have gone, or whether or not those barriers exist. Now, this opens up a very unique equation for the United States. Now, I can't really speak about how affirmative action, you know, has worked in other parts of the world, but here in the United States, it's actually very interesting. If we take, for example, federal housing policy from approximately the 1940s through the early 1970s, federal law was that Black people were not allowed to buy houses and property in the suburbs. So, and very few people know that now. And it was, in fact, you know, while people are busy calling Mitt Romney, for example, one of the candidates for president back in 2000, what year is this? 2012.
2012.
It's interesting. My awareness of time has kind of faded through this isolation here. It's actually people. What day is it? I have no idea what day it is. But Mitt Romney's dad, Sergeant Romney, fought really hard he was the director of housing and urban development for the federal government under Richard Nixon. And he actually destroyed his political career by fighting tooth and nail to have those regulations overturned so that Black people could actually live wherever they wanted to live and be treated equally. And this is why I'm so frustrated with a lot of the political conversation now that has no awareness of this history. And they're busy name calling in ways that are basically not only unjust, but they're fundamentally untrue. And what they do is it ultimately produces this revisionist history. So my point is through all of that time where Black families were not allowed to purchase in certain parts of town, this is the original definition of redlining, if people are familiar with that, that means they were not able to hand those houses down generationally. They were not able to avail of the increase in the property values over that time through, that's basically, let's call it 5 generations, 6 generations of people that were not able to avail of that. Meanwhile, their American compatriots were certainly able to capitalize on the amazing advances in terms of the real estate values that they held. They could pass that wealth down to their kids. They could borrow against that equity and send their kids to the best colleges, et cetera. And meanwhile, Black people were still stuck in areas where they weren't even lending money to help them maintain the properties. So we get this ghetto. and we assume that Black people are just incapable of maintaining their properties. When in reality, if you go to places that have been successful, and certainly even around Los Angeles, you'll see that all Black neighborhoods are populated by professionals who have maintained their houses very well. There's parts of Compton, I mean, I'm sure everyone listening is familiar with Compton. There are parts of Compton that are gorgeous, that are incredibly well manicured and incredibly well cared for. But since there's nobody blowing anything up down there, it's not in the news and you don't know about it. There's parts in Los Angeles that are exactly like that. Neighborhoods completely populated by Black people who own their homes, who are paying for their homes, who have high credit ratings. But again, nobody's blowing anything up, so you've never heard of them. But millions of people were, in effect, we cry about the voting franchise, but a lot of people were literally, disenfranchised from the American dream by federal housing policy. And as long as people don't know that, they're not really getting the full story about where and how Black people have ended up where they end up. So getting back to your question, it's ultimately this this dynamic where I do believe in the early days that affirmative action could be something that would benefit a community that was deliberately isolated and literally had no other chance to move ahead. And that's a very different situation from what kind of exists today. It's a little bit more equitable. It's a little bit more accessible. But if you are 3, 4, 5 generations into having no contact with the outside world, the outside economic world I'm referring to specifically here, you're not even going to think to look. You're not even going to think to say, hey, well, I could go work for this engineering firm. I mean, no, it's not only is it is something you don't have the skills for, but you're never even going to consider going in that direction to do it. So I really
it's not even in your consciousness, is it?
Not at all. Not only is it not in your consciousness, it's not in your community. It's not in any part of your daily existence. The MITRE Corporation, Stone and Blacker, big engineering firms in Boston don't exist unless you've been introduced to them. And if you live primarily in the Black community, you've never heard of them. I mean, I was very blessed that my parents were together, which is a very important dynamic. And they did their absolute best to introduce me to things that were outside of the neighborhood. And I would say, by and large, they succeeded. They didn't go far enough because they themselves couldn't take it any farther, but they did expose me to things that I'm very grateful for today. My dad exposed me to photography and filmmaking. When I was a kid, he had his 8mm camera and he had his Yashica medium format camera. And I gathered those skills, made my first film was a sequel to Star Wars. Other people began to introduce me to science and engineering. And my dad was in the Air Force and he introduced me to aviation, which I'm obsessive about aviation. So those are the things that I'm very grateful for that helped me understand that there is a world outside the world that I was looking at, because I got to grow up watching people get shot at. I got to watch people get stabbed in drug deals gone bad. I saw my first kilos of cocaine in the back of a Lincoln Continental right outside my house, parked on the side street right adjacent to my house. I got to see people almost every weekend carted out on carts, not the carts, but the stretcher into the ambulance after being shot or stabbed at the nightclub that was 2 doors away from me. So I got to see some horrific things, but thanks to my parents, I never felt that I was trapped in that area. I always knew that there was something beyond the horizon. And that's kind of what saved me, and that's what pulled me out. But, that takes sacrifice on the part of people's parents. And a lot of parents aren't in the position to make that sacrifice.
So it sounds to me like really to even, to understand how to develop social policy, you need to have a really, really good understanding of the nuances of this. Because, what you're describing of Black people, living in these clusters, it's almost like a reverse gentrification. And then when you try and fix it with gentrification then just squeezes people out of the areas they could otherwise afford. Mm-hmm. So who do you think in the United States has the level of sophistication to even understand, the complexities and the best way to deal with this?
The very last people that anyone in power would listen to. We have economists such as Thomas Sowell. We have other, Walter Williams, for example. These are 2 Black economists who speak a language of the accurate history of the country, and certainly the accurate economic history of the country. So for example, it was through Thomas Sowell that I learned that prior to the 1960s, something like 78% of all Black people in the United States had their own businesses. Now, granted, most of those businesses were quite small, but they were all independent. They were doing it on their own. They were getting clients on their own. They were producing revenue for their families on their own. And 80 to 90% of all Black children were born to married family, to married father and mother. Fast forward to now, where 78% of all Black children are born to single family households, and specifically single mother households. And most of those mothers are supported by the welfare state. So that's a very, very different dynamic. And it's not a conversation that we're even willing to have right now as it relates to what is the impact of single motherhood on economics, what is the impact of single motherhood on the society. We know that something like 70 or 80% of all prison inmates were raised in single mother households. In addition to that, we have this other phenomenon of undiagnosed autism, which is a phenomenon that I'm personally looking into because it is also another form of keeping a group segregated and profitable. So for example, I've discovered, actually I was told, I didn't discover it, but I was told that Black children and Latino children are deliberately underreported in terms of their autism. And I said, huh. And I'd learned through a documentary that something like 30 to 40% of minority children are undiagnosed with autism. But here's what happens in my view. I just finished, in fact, we just won an Emmy Award for a documentary on the foster care system in Southern California. And what I learned through that was that 70% of inmates, again, came through the foster care system. So what I began to put two and two together, if you are undiagnosed autistic, you're going to have behaviors that are well out of the norm. And it certainly depends on the level of spectrum that you're at, be it low, be it high. If you are autistic, you might be extremely impatient. You might see things in a certain way. You might not be able to see things down the road and put two and two together as it relates to cause and effect in many cases. You might have a very concrete understanding of the world, and your thinking might be very short term. And of course, you're going to be an extreme discipline problem if you're going to school. But if you're undiagnosed, no one is going to take the time to go, oh, this person is autistic and they need to be raised and nurtured under these dynamics. Well, what's going to happen is that kid is just simply going to be labeled a troublemaker. That person is going to be put into the special classes and not dealt with. And before long, that person is going to be in trouble with the law. And before long, that person is going to be in jail. And before long, that person is going to be in prison. So as we discuss race, it's impossible to discuss race without beginning to factor in all these other dynamics that lead to behavioral issues and the deliberate underreporting of behavioral issues in minorities. Because if you're talking about the prison to the school or the elementary school, the kindergarten to prison pipeline, well,
the pipeline.
The pipeline, there's a good indication of how they get there. And it's an indication that that pipeline is quite deliberate, because if you don't, I mean, think of how much money they're saving by not properly diagnosing minorities with autism. And then they end up in prison, and then you don't have to spend the money on the services to get them the treatment that they need to support their autism.
The interesting thing, though, that if with the white kids who go through the same process are often, almost overdiagnosed and put on things like Ritalin, which then supposedly contribute to things like school shootings.
Yes.
So you'd have also you'd have to be careful of how you even went in to treat that problem within the Black community, because the last thing you want is bringing the mistakes that were made, in the wealthier white community into the Black community.
Right. Well, here's the tragic of that. And I have done research into the impact of the antipsychotic, antidepressive drugs, right? Especially Ritalin, as it relates to ADHD in the school system. And that actually boils down to a gender dynamic. 75% of the students diagnosed with ADHD are boys. And what ends up happening is, scientifically, it's known that all boys need is exercise to eliminate all that nervous energy, and then they can focus. This is a well-known thing. In fact, it's being done in Texas, and I spoke to a doctor out here who actually has a school that specializes in ADHD boys. And she knows full well that it's not drugs that'll take care of it. It's just exercise. Let them run around in the morning. So I actually did some homework, and I found that school system after school system after school system had a 50-50 population of boys to girls. But in all of them, the average of 75%, and in some cases up to 95% of the boys in that school system were given those anti-ADHD drugs. So the bigger conversation around that dynamic is really a gender issue more than it gets down to a race issue by far. So in my view, what you're only going to end up doing is taking the same gender mistakes that have gone into the bigger system, and you're going to introduce them into the Black community. So the dynamic of school shootings, we're already seeing last weekend, 82 people shot, 22 of them died in Chicago. When was the last school shooting, and how many people were affected by that? And I'm not justifying either. I'm just saying, look at the reality. So the shootings are already going on. So
and that is the big focus in the white community, that you have a school shooting where 2, 3, even 10 people are shot, and it takes up the media cycle for a good week. But then that's a good weekend in Chicago.
Correct. In fact, that might even just be a good Saturday, night in Chicago. My take on it is this whole, the tears and the hugs and all this stuff that's going on, specifically from sort of the white community here in the United States regarding the George Floyd incident, is a lie until these same groups are marching in Chicago, until these same white people are taking themselves to Chicago and trying to put a stop to the shootings that are going on, basically literally every weekend. Their sympathies to me are meaningless without a consistent piece of action, because ultimately what they don't realize is they are complicit in allowing the police forces to do what they do as sanctioned by the city. In fact, I was shocking people, which wasn't a surprise to me, when I discovered that the knee to neck policy that was practiced on George Floyd in Minneapolis is actually official policy of the Minneapolis Police Department. Is completely allowed. And it's completely allowed in a lot of police jurisdictions, but nobody really understood that. So what we do is we culturally basically vilify and demonize the officer that did it. And then we get upset because those officers that end up killing people in obviously needless ways are then found not guilty of murder. Why? Because they were acting within the policy of the police department. But because we don't tend to be smart cultures, we don't look any further than the person that actually did it. We don't look at the fact that that person was sanctioned by law, by the city that they were working with, or whatever jurisdiction they were working on, to do exactly what he or she did. And we don't understand, therefore, why, quote unquote, justice wasn't served when justice by legal definition was served. So our ignorance of that is problematic, obviously. So what white people could do, and I'm saying that very specifically because they have the resources, they have the backgrounds, they have the contacts, to understand what's actually going on is going to require some work. It's going to require some commitment to work their way up to Chicago to find out what's going on there, and then work their way back down the chain to understand what went on in Minneapolis, in New York, or wherever it goes on. So it's going to take some work, and it can't be solved by marches and placards and crying.
And putting an overlay on your Facebook profile photo.
And putting an overlay on your Facebook profile. Sorry, guys. Sorry, gang. That's not going to happen.
It's interesting because, the more you talk to people about this subject, the more you realize how really ignorant people are of just how things work in the United States.
Welcome to my life.
The extent of the problem. And do you think that occurs in the Black community as well? Do you think, the Black community have a better understanding of what the problems are?
Well, yes, but they literally have no voice. And this brings up Malcolm X, because back in the 60s, he was crystal clear that the worst enemy that the Black community has is the white liberal. And that quote, I heard that years ago, and now that quote is becoming famous again, because he's really clear to say that the quote unquote white liberal is utterly disingenuous, is only pursuant of power, and absolutely has no caring or interest in actually doing anything for anyone other than themselves. Now, when I first heard that, probably a decade and a half ago, maybe longer, I was like, wow, that's a very extreme statement. I mean, I can't imagine that that's completely true. But the only thing that has been revealed to me since I first heard that statement is how completely right he actually was. That the people who are out there fighting and screaming for all this, racial justice are not Black people. They know that better than 95% of Antifa members are white, and a huge majority of them are white feminists, meaning specifically women. I did give them credit for the equal opportunity in terms of who they employ in their rank and file and their leadership, because there's a lot of women who are part of Antifa. So kudos to them on their fair employment practices. But other than that, they're not representing the poor and downtrodden. And they're certainly not representing at all the Black community.
Interesting. So you're probably as likely to see a Black Antifa member as you are a Black suffragette.
Yes. Yeah.
Which actually keys really well into our second question. So we'll pull you up there, and Jessi, I'll hand you over for the second question.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. We're feeding right into it. So our second question was, what effect does the social justice movement have on Black men in specific?
Oof.
You kind of touched on some of it.
Yeah. This is a big one, and this is one that I spend a lot of time, looking into on this particular area and other areas. So I think first and foremost, society has absolutely no respect, caring, empathy, sympathy, or soft spot for men at all, no matter where they come from. And I've rationalized that that's actually a good thing, because men need to operate with some level of autonomy, and in fact, a lot of autonomy. So to not be cared for fundamentally as a man is not necessarily inherently a bad thing. So I'll start there. Because that's what enables us to go fight. That's what enables us to go take risks. That's part of masculinity, is to be kind of independent and have the ability to go out, do what we got to do, and then come back. That's what allows us to go out and come back and not be terribly worried about it. It's what allows us to go to the moon and go, yeah, I guess I'll be back or not be back, or orbit with the ISS, on a spaceship and leave your family behind. That dynamic, that independence is actually what men are, right? So what we've done culturally is we have, in our battle to say that we are all the same, that all races are the same, that all genders are the same, all ideas are the same in value, we have eliminated the possibility of some ideas being good and some ideas being not so good. We've eliminated, basically, we've vilified the entire idea of competence. We've eliminated the idea that a dynamic of credibility, competence, skills, that they matter. We make it mean that they don't matter anymore. And when you make it mean that some kind of competence and skill and hierarchy, and that's a bad word these days, matters, you basically open up the only possibility toward anything is collectivism. You open up that if everyone is the same, then everyone needs the same handout from the same source, and therefore everybody will be happy. But we know historically that that's utterly impossible. So bringing it up to the social justice movement, we know that the social justice movement has its roots in communism, via socialism, via Marxism, because the only solution that they ever present, ultimately, if you grill them long enough, and in some cases you don't have to grill them that hard or that long, the first and only real solution that they have is we must transfer the entire system to a Marxist platform. So part of that Marxist platform is feminism. Feminism is literally the daughter of Marxism. And it too is a collectivist movement. It too has no respect for men. So to get back to your question, any collectivist, social justivist, any type of reparative, restorative justice movement, they all have their roots in socialism, and all of socialism wants to destroy men as a whole. So if we take a group that's already in trouble, we're only going to push them down further and ultimately destroy them, to the point that we are 85% of suicides. Now, one of the big myths, I don't call them myths though, I call them lies, is that men commit suicide more frequently because they can't express their feelings. Well, the trouble with that argument is that there's zero evidence supporting that argument, but nobody cares. Nobody cares about facts or evidence when they're making this argument. They say, oh, well, men are killing themselves because they don't get to express themselves. Well, who's that argument going to resonate with? That argument is going to resonate with women. Women are going to automatically, because if women don't get to express their emotions, they're likely going to harm themselves in some way. But men, we never get to express our emotions. We've never been able to express our emotions. And lo and behold, we've never mass killed ourselves. We started to kill ourselves, men that is, when we were disenfranchised from the community, when we were isolated, when we were shoved aside, when we are forced to pay child support for children that are not ours. And that's legal extortion. We're committing suicide when we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight for kids versus the lies that we've somehow abused them or the wife or ex-wife. That's the stuff that where our careers are destroyed and our credibility is destroyed and our name is destroyed in the communities. That's why men are committing suicide, not because we don't get to express it. In fact, when we do express our emotions, what are we told? Go grow a pair. Get out of here. What kind of little baby are you?
Is there a significant father's rights movement in the Black community, or is the Black community that destroyed that you're not even at that point yet?
I would say that it is significant in its force and its clarity, but I would not say that it's significant in its numbers. But I would say it's actually growing quite rapidly. And I would say that this is the one area where there is no color line. That at the same pace that Black men are understanding how unjust the family court system is, white men are discovering how unjust the family court system is. In fact, I was just talking to and working with a gentleman who is going through that right now. He happens to be white, but he also represents and has his own organization working really hard to fight court corruption. So it's very active, and that's one place where you definitely see a diversity of races and ethnicities when it comes to how poorly these men are being treated by basically by the system.
Mm-hmm.
And do Black men find themselves the subject of domestic violence allegations in the family court? Do they fight them in different ways to the way white men deal with them? I mean, I'm guessing that the lack of resource would be an issue. And just quickly on that, it comes to mind, to bring up things like the Brock Turner case, which was interesting in California, in that Brock Turner was obviously from a wealthy family, and he got a 3-month sentence, which means that his plea bargain was less than 3 months, because the plea bargain offer is always less. So, when you hear, the Brock Turner story, the first thing that comes to mind is, how many Black men you have taking plea deals, as opposed to, white men who have families wealthy enough to fight. And I'm guessing that must happen in the family court system extensively.
Well, the Brock Turner case is actually quite interesting, because I looked into that, and the facts of that case would lead themselves to have him only have a 3-month sentence. The facts of that case are not at all representative of what was reported in the press. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not an expert on it, but I can say that the facts of that case, and similarly the facts of the oh my goodness, the lady who was found hanged in her jail cell last year. And I forget it. I was just speaking about her extensively this weekend. Well, the reality was, the evidence is, Malcolm Gladwell actually did a huge chapter in his book about that case. And what he found, basically from going to the police station, looking at the actual police reports and the evidence, what he found was a number of things that never really came out in terms of the press. He found
Sandra
Bland. Yes.
Bland.
There we go. He found out that the police were trained, and this gets back to policing and their training, that the police were trained to pull people over for the most minuscule infractions that they can possibly identify. And in her case, they found, I think she had a tail light out or something. And the police officer pulled her over. Malcolm was really clear that he misinterpreted her lighting that cigarette as an act of defiance, when in fact, anybody who smokes knows that lighting a cigarette is a way to release tension and calm anxiety. And it is not in any way a form of a show of force or a show of resistance. The police officer took it as a form of resistance, escalated the situation, arrested her. She was in jail in the jail for 3 days, basically unsupervised. What Malcolm identified was that she had been having, or she had a history of severe mental disturbances, severe mental illness, depression, and suicidal thoughts. And she was very, very prone to having extreme levels of anxiety. So basically, all this experience did for her was cause her anxiety to shoot through the roof. Now, I have some really close friends that suffer from severe anxiety, and I've seen them have anxiety meltdowns and breakdowns. And I didn't really understand how quickly triggered they can be, because I'm not one that's prone to sharp. I mean, I recognize now that there are elements where I have anxiety, and everybody has it, but to see someone who suffers from it as a diagnosed thing in their lives is actually very interesting. And Sandra Bland definitely had that. And being in jail for something she knew was wrong, drove her anxiety through the roof. And the evidence is that she did indeed hang herself. But that is not what the popular narrative about her situation is. And that's why I'm slow to look at situations and their outcomes and judge them based on what I read in the press. I mean, for example, we know objectively that when women commit crimes, they're sentenced to prison to the rate of 60% less in terms of what they're sentenced to than a man having done the same crime and then sentenced to prison. And in many cases, women are just basically being told, well, you had a bad day, you can head on home. So obviously, this is going to impact men more severely. And of course, it's going to ultimately, in terms of policing and the legal system, it's going to impact Black men even more. If a Black man steals a loaf of bread, or a Black woman steals a loaf of bread, they're in jail for 30 years. You know, how is that fair? So again, it gets back to institutional things that must be really examined long before it deals exclusively with race. So I know I've sort of made it a bigger answer, but.
Well, but.
No, but sorry, Jessi, go.
No, go ahead. You probably have a better formed question.
No, please. I'm on a satellite link here, so there's a bit of a delay. So,
is the social justice movement then basically hurting men? I don't know if you saw, we did a show on men's rights in India, and found out that feminists in high caste, in the high classes of India, consider themselves more oppressed than the men. And don't you kind of have that with the social justice movement, where privileged white women are putting themselves below unprivileged Black men?
Oh boy. Short answer is yes. That feminism basically dominates the social oppression hierarchy. The social justice movement is how they do it. It's sort of the political wing of feminism, if you will, minus its own, political wing of itself. I find that all those movements are disastrously misinformed and deliberately misinformed. I have heard arguments of why social justice in that regard is good, but I've had lots of white people tell me as a Black man in my own personal experience why it's a bad thing. And I sort of sit there and listen patiently and go, yeah, thanks for that. Having seen what I've seen firsthand, I find it laughable that people sit down with absolute confidence and tell me how much I'm oppressed and how bad my life has been. I've lived all over the world. I've traveled all over the world. I am a filmmaker and a producer and a director. I have an Emmy Award under my belt, but I shouldn't have any of those things, apparently. Oh, not to mention the master's degree that I got in Ireland, by the way. So these are things that, I've done more by the time I was 25 than most people will do in 3 lifetimes. Was I oppressed? I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in Dorchester. Donna Summer went to high school blocks away from me. The Bobby Brown basically was found, was discovered, with the New Edition right there in Dorchester. Mark Wahlberg and his brothers are from the other side of Dorchester. So it was a very blue collar universe. But many of us got out, many of us went on to do a lot of other things. So
And
I find,
can I ask? Can I
sure.
ask? You mentioned anxiety before. That I'd imagine that if people are suffering from anxiety, constantly harping on about how oppressed they are, whether that's true or not, must feed into that anxiety. And that's I've read the Malcolm Gladwell chapter on Sandra Bland as well. And the thing that strikes me listening to the recordings from the camera the police officer had, the body cam, is how quickly she snapped into social justice mode. So, there was a misunderstanding of what she was going through, but there was also a misunderstanding on her part of what the police officer had to go through.
Right.
And her switching into that social justice, I'm oppressed mode, really it didn't seem to have much of an effect on him, but it really, really wound her up.
Exactly. And in my view, what you're observing is the product of indoctrination, where basically the person is given a script of how to respond to given situations, and that's the only script that they have. They are unable to deal with a situation in real time. They are unable to address the situation based on the factors that are going on, and they can only look at it through this institutionally biased lens that they've been handed through whoever hands them their indoctrination lessons, and they follow it to the T.
So the concept of things like microaggressions, where, when I look at, the goals of Martin Luther King, and I then look at where we're at now with terms like microaggressions, when I'm talking to you as a white man to a black man, the first thing I have to do is take into account that you're a black man to avoid making sure that I don't microaggress you in any way.
Right.
But to me, that seems to be a perverse way of dealing with the problem.
It's completely perverse, because what it does, well, all it does is it puts you ill at ease. It does nothing more than make you off balance. It puts you out of your intellectual core. It puts you out of a respectful core or even a neutral mode into a negative. You're required to think negatively about yourself. You're required to think that, oh my goodness, you have this inherent power, therefore you have to pull back on it. You're required to believe that somehow I am still inferior to you in some way, and you have to pretend to be equal to me. In fact, there's science around the fact that when white liberals specifically talk to minorities, they will literally consciously dumb their own vocabulary down to be able to speak to other people. And, this is what that produces, so inside a competence hierarchy, for example, which is where I like and prefer to operate from, my listening is about how competent is the person in front of me. Does this person ask the right questions? Does this person know the topic that they're speaking on? Based on their level of competence, that's how I judge the person that I'm dealing with. I don't judge it on the basis of the color of their skin or their gender. If someone walks up to me and says, hey, let's talk about airplanes, and they don't know what a control surface is, then I'm not going to be able to hold that person as being competent in my mind as I speak to them. If I'm going to talk about feminism, and I ask what are the benefits of feminism, and they tell me, well, men can now cry in public, I know I'm speaking with a person who hasn't studied this at all on their own. So it's not about race again. It's about, in my view, competence and the ability to know and learn about a specific topic. And what is the thing what's going on in schools the least in the Black community? Learning. People are not encouraged to read. They're not encouraged to learn stuff on their own. They're just encouraged to embrace gender and diversity as our strength and social justice. That's exactly what these schools are teaching, and that's exactly what these kids are absorbing, and they are completely unprepared for the real world. I'm sorry, the noise factor is upon us.
We're not hearing that at this end.
Okay,
but I think, and Jess, this is something I'd like Jessi's input into, that it seems to me that the way that men are now being taught to interact with each other is a very feminine approach. So that,
of course it is.
The way the men deal with each other is, through challenge. So, black men and white men working alongside each other as equals, even if there are terms that are used that are racist, will quickly sort themselves out as humor or a form of almost hazing. So that's how men deal with things. That
Right.
I might use some black slur against you, and you'll use some white slur against me, and that will then become the way that we communicate. And it doesn't necessarily have to entrench racism. In fact, it equalizes racism. But it seems that now we're being dictated to as men on the ways that we have to communicate with each other based upon the way that women negotiate their relationships.
Right.
Jessi, what are your thoughts on, can I just ask Jessi, do you think I've summed that up adequately? What's your thoughts on what I've just said?
Well, sometimes it's hard for me because I'm not the quote unquote typical woman. So I don't relate to women the way that women relate to women, but I absolutely do. I think so. Like trying to tiptoe around feelings and, be polite, even when it's the opposite of what you're actually thinking in your head. Those are female things. And so if we're asking people, if you're kind of subliminally telling people Black people are less than you, but you need to treat them like that, that is a feminine approach. I would agree.
And it seems that when I went to Nigeria, I kind of got to experience what it was to be, the only white face, really in view, that you could go for a day and, not see another white face. And the Nigerians have a term for white men. I think it's, and wherever you go, you would hear this, being mentioned, which was obviously about me. And I turned to my Nigerian friend and said, hey, I'm kind of getting the impression that this word is actually about me. I said, what does it mean? And he went, oh, it's white. So, and he and I was able to explain to him, that you would never be able to say that in the United States. And we had a good laugh about it. And that's kind of how men deal with these things. I think women tend to deal with them differently. And I just have to wonder how the way that white women deal with Black women is held back just in the same way that the relationships between Black and white men are by this feminine approach.
Well, to go back to the beginning of what you're describing, I would argue that one of the goals of feminism, and since the US, and I believe to some degree Australia and the UK, live in a feminist-dominated culture, as much as they love to deny it, the first goal is to completely feminize men so that the feminine values can dominate the society. So what does that mean? That means that men have to be trained out of their normal natural instincts and become feminine in their behaviors, certainly not their nature, which is inherently oppressive. And we're then required to, just as you described, say things in a certain way, do things in a certain way. And I'll make a slight detour, is that this goes right back to the impact and practices of postmodernism as it's been shoved into the academic system through colleges and out into the society now. So yes, the absolute goal is to feminize men because, oh my goodness, toxic masculinity. Well, the answer to absolving or dissolving toxic masculinity is always make men more like women. End of story. And of course, that is not only harmful, but it's destructive to the entire society, which is ultimately the goal. Because if we're ultimately to produce a socialist economy, we have to eliminate men, and we have to certainly eliminate all of their influence. And by definition, by destroying men's awareness of their own competence and possibility and limiting their ability to be inventive and innovative, you ultimately destroy the core of man. And as a result, that man is not going to simply comply. That man is going to die in any number of forms. That man will cease to produce. That man will cease ultimately to exist. And that's exactly what they want. And that's ultimately the title of that's actually a core of the article that I'm in the process of writing right now.
But what I see now is that that charade is starting to dissolve. That, you know, I think we're starting to see black men, you know, turn on CNN, and between men, the charade that feminism or social justice has inflicted on us is just dissolving before our eyes. And
Well,
what we're now starting to see is black women turn on white women. So this whole Karen meme that's popped up really originates from black women turning on white women. That it was coined within the black female community against white women.
Right. I honestly don't know what its source is, but what I can say is this: is that certainly white feminists have never had anything good to say or any desire to support black women. This has been known by black feminists from the 60s. In fact, the only people that I really saw that had any legitimate axe to grind as it relates to equal treatment who were women were black feminists, because they were really citing some really serious and really intense levels of discrimination and hatred, most of which was applied to them via white women. So I think that black women just took a while to have a public meme about white women, but they didn't really turn on them per se. They were abandoned. You know, mainstream, AKA white feminism, has always been an enemy to black women. It has always been racist in its roots. If you look at the original, feminists, and even while they were fighting for the, for the vote, they made it clear that black people were not part of this movement. They did not want black people to have the vote ever. They did not want black people to be treated equally. If you look at Margaret Sanger, and it's coming out that she and her eugenics practice, her number one reason for wanting abortion was to eliminate the black race. So this is nothing new in terms of what's been going on. The only thing new is this meme where they're finally getting called out for it.
And how do we address that without becoming social justice warriors ourselves? That it seems that we're using almost the terminology and the tactics of social justice to expose social justice.
Well, I think the biggest advantage that we have in terms of our ability to win is the truth. And I don't say that hyperbolically. I say that literally. One of the things that I've observed I've barked up every claim that, for example, feminism makes, and I found that every single claim they make is either completely inaccurate or is willfully distorted. So when you take a look at truth versus fiction, everything that's going on within the social justice movement is based on a lie. There's not a single thing that they claim that can be supported with fact. So if we take a look, so for example, at police killings of black men, well, police killings by black men is the lowest number of people that the police ultimately kill. The largest number of killings of men in general is white men killed by the police, by far. And if you then are really about Black Lives Matter, 95% of all black people are killed by other black people who happen to be civilians, not by the police. There's not a single person who died or was shot in Chicago over the weekend that was shot by a policeman. There's not a single person who died. Of the 22 people who died in Chicago this past weekend, none of them were shot by the police. So if you're serious about it, the truth needs to be addressed, not this entirely fake dynamic that the police are targeting or hunting black men. That is a lie to the highest order. Now, people that don't want to believe that that's a lie are going to get irate over that statement. But if you look at the facts, if you look at the evidence, if you look at the reports, if you actually go dig up those police reports, you'll discover very quickly that basically everything that's claimed by this social justice, political justice, restorative justice is based on a lie. Even the lie of like domestic violence, for example. We're taught to believe that domestic violence is strictly men assaulting women, and that's the end of the story, and therefore men have to be taught to not violate. But if you actually look at and therefore we get things like the Duluth model for domestic violence, which is now practiced by the police, most police departments in the United States, and probably the UK and Australia, that basically says if there's a domestic violence call, always assume that the man's the perpetrator. Even if he has a knife stuck in his head, and even if he's on the floor unconscious, always assume that the man is the perpetrator. So great. So what does that look like? Well, that looks like a man with a knife in his head and unconscious on the floor somehow is the perpetrator, to a woman who then called the police.
What we're finding in Australia is that, The vast majority of domestic violence occurs within the Aboriginal community. They're only 3% of the population, but extrapolated, it looks like about 70% of the domestic violence happens within that 3% of the community.
Right.
Basically, that's ignored, that there's
Yes.
so much focus on spending money on vilifying white men who are probably the least likely to be committing domestic violence.
Correct.
And the narrative is that it's about privilege, not disadvantage, that clearly domestic violence is about disadvantage. So in the Black community, in poor parts of the Black community, how much resource are they being denied by the fact that we have to ignore that it happens to continue the narrative that it's oppression and not disadvantage?
Well, it literally means that you have this ongoing disenfranchised community that's living reality, and it shows up in Chicago with 89 people shot, 22 dead in a single weekend. That's what that looks like. To perpetrate this lie, we have to accept. So
really, you think that the social justice lie and tactics is really probably the biggest enabler or the biggest disabler of us fixing the problem? Absolutely it is. And with obvious effect. You know, if all problems in society boil down to white men, well, it's just an overall tactic to disempower white men, to push them aside so that they can basically have the biggest power grab in history. It's happening all over the place. And it happens, basically what I'm arguing is that there is a collective form of genocide being executed among men. And if you look at the United Nations definition for what genocide is, not only is it about mass murder, but it's also about moving populations and targeting specific populations to deliberately harm them. So under the UN definition of genocide, what's happening right now, if you look at what's happening to men in its entirety, it qualifies as the UN definition of genocide. We're looking at how men are systematically moved out of their families through the family courts. We're looking at men systematically separated from their money and their careers in many cases through the family courts. Through false allegations, they are lied to and their entire lives are destroyed. Now, that's happening to individual men one by one. But if you zoom out and you look at it as a system, there is nothing shy or short of a deliberate genocide that's institutionally provided for against men. And I don't know why no one's ever said that before. I don't know why I'm the person that sort of realized this, but that's why I'm writing an article on it. And I guess I'm telling you the first. Been trying to keep it a secret because I don't want to let it leak out too far. But I believe that there's a systematic genocide against men going on, and it needs to be addressed as a genocide, not just as bad luck and who hurt you, baby.
You know, honestly, from you talking, it seems to me like, it almost makes you wonder, do you think if women were out of the way, could men have resolved racism by now?
That's actually a good question. If women were out of the way, could men have resolved racism by now? No, I don't think so. I think things would be very different. I don't exactly know what you mean by out of the way, but I don't think it would have changed. I think that if you look at, how long was empire the way to go, where all races were considered to be inferior to whoever was going after empire. Empire was not race-based. Empire was active long before it ever made it to Europe. We go back to Hannibal. We go back to Alexander the Great. We go back to Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, as I think people are now more correctly apparently pronouncing his name. But I don't believe that. I believe that we are more egalitarian as a process of experience, as a process of maturity, as a process of, in some ways, getting smarter, recognizing that human life is valuable, as opposed to just being a commodity. But what we have done is we've culturally destroyed it. We've said that female life is more valuable than male life, and therefore we can destroy men. Now, there is a philosophy going around that discusses men as disposable. It is not one that I necessarily disagree with, but the reality is we've taken away the, let's call it the privilege or the honor of being disposable, and made men basically vilified on all fronts and all levels. Because the only thing that has men stand up and say, yeah, I'm going to go put myself in line to get shot at in some country overseas, is the fact that we are honored for that behavior. but we're no longer honored for that behavior. And it's the same way with marriage. I'm going to enter a contract with someone that benefits me not one bit. There's no benefit for men in marriage at all. But there was the honor, there was the social pat on the back that said, you're a good man for having a family. And men signed up for that. They said, sure, great, this is awesome. I'm going to go do this. But now the jig is up. It is now very public that men are not benefiting from marriage. And we're seeing the lowest marriage rates in history. We're seeing the lowest childbirth rates in history. And we're seeing that cats are going to have a very bright future. Because what's happening is, you know, women who are vilifying these men are not partnering because nobody wants to partner with that. And therefore they're alone and they're trying to, you know, self-partner and whatever other excuse they can make for basically not being partnered. And men are saying, no, I don't want to be a part of that. So what are men doing? Men are launching spaceships. Men are building all kinds of, you know, inventions. Men are starting their own businesses. Men are gaining their own sovereignty by not signing up for something that has every chance of destroying them. So the same thing, I think, is happening in the Black community, where Black community is waking up and recognizing, oh my goodness, these white liberals really don't have my best interest at heart. Oh, this guy over here that's apparently a Nazi and a rapist and he's orange. Apparently he's actually doing more for the Black community than all these local politicians. And I can say that I got to see that as well, growing up in Dorchester, which was one of those early Black empowerment neighborhoods. And I got to see the quote unquote Black community rise up. I mean, I got to see the devastation of my family and the people around me in '68 when Dr. King was killed. And I got to see again the images of forced busing. I got to see socialism come into the city and watch it decay before my very eyes. I got to see the city come back when there was Republicans in charge of the administration. I got to see flowers and trees be planted. I got to see roads get paved that weren't paved for 20 years. I saw a very big difference with my own eyes. And Black people are waking up to that reality as well, as to who is ultimately benefiting their community, what environments are conducive to them growing and becoming more autonomous than what they've been promised and have gotten nothing. Because if you think about it, let's take a dive into this. If you think about what's going on in the inner city, who gets to vote in the inner city? Oh my goodness, it's basically all women. Why? Because once you have to go to jail, you lose your right to vote. And if you're looking at a community where the majority of men go to jail, well, they're losing their franchise. They're losing their ability to vote. And what do we know women vote for? They vote for free stuff. And that free stuff comes with a promise of, oh, things are going to get better. And what do we also know about the female demographic? They're not necessarily all that tied to outcomes. So you can promise them something and promise them something and promise them something, and they're going to keep voting for it, and they're going to keep voting for it, and they're going to keep voting for it, and it doesn't matter to them if they ever get it or not. So the ghetto becomes the ghetto, becomes the ghetto, becomes the ghetto.
The idea that Black people vote for free stuff is really just
Black women, let's be clear, because Black men don't have the franchise.
That so many Black men have been disenfranchised by imprisonment. Because I suppose when you take into account the fact that, you know, not everyone goes to prison for life, I remember seeing a statistic that some huge number of Black men have actually been through the prison system. I forget what the statistic was, but it was a very high number.
Yeah, exactly. And with the exception of Florida, they permanently lose their right to vote, which I think is ludicrous, quite honestly. So they're out. They're not part of the democratic process anymore. So now there's this incredible voting bias that goes on in the Black community that is not really correctable.
What effect does that have on Black men? Do you think Black men are aware of their level of disenfranchisement?
They are to a degree, but if you're talking 2, 3, 4 generations deep of not having it, again, what we're talking, just like we were talking about the professional opportunities a while ago, it doesn't really cross their mind. It doesn't really matter to them anymore. You know, we're you know, if that person's father never got to vote, if that person's father's father didn't get to vote, voting becomes a non-issue.
So McCall, if there was one thing that you could change before you die, what would it be?
As controversial as it might be, I would argue that men need to understand for themselves what masculinity is. It has a real definition and it has a real purpose. And the more that men forget what that purpose is, to show up, produce, die on time, and that's our only role in our existence, the further we get away from that, the more things fall apart in our society.
Okay, so if you could change one thing, it would be that men get back to understanding that that's their role in society?
Correct. And a lot of people are going to disagree with that and be very upset by that. But and there's a lot of things that it doesn't imply. It does not imply a removal of equality. It does not imply a return to isolation and oppression. But it does require that men basically return to having a mission in life. Understanding what their value is. Men have no conscious awareness of what their value is in the culture or society anymore, because that role, that value has been taken away from them. But the reality is nobody ever gave it to them in the first place. Men inherently understand what their role, not their role, but their value is to themselves. And the further we get away from that understanding, the less productive, the less confident, the less competent men become. And the consequences are pretty obvious.
All right, terrific. Well, they're great words. And thanks again for joining our show and educating us a bit about your thoughts on racism.
Sure. I'll look forward to all the hate mail I'm going to be getting.
Enjoy the curfew too.
Yes. Yeah, it's been interesting, to say the least. So thank you all. Thanks for having me.
See.
Thank you.
Thank you.